Ani lo yodea. I don't know. That's what the song is called. I don't know. What an important statement we often can and should make in our lives. Ani lo yodea. I don't know. That sets the stage for being open and learning something new. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. That was Joey Newcomb's song, Ani lo yodea. We're working our way through his album, To Be a Yid. Who is with us as we get together to do some beautiful learning on a Thursday night? I apologize for being a few minutes late. I was attending my first meeting as the coach of the 2022 Maccabiah Games USA Masters team, meeting the other athletes, other coaches of the other divisions, the open, the juniors, the women, etc. We had a team meeting, very excited about going to Israel next summer as the coach of the Masters golf team. Who's with us on a Thursday night? Paula in Chicago, Yehuda in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Belle in Texas, John in Maine, Stephen in Oklahoma, Nancy in North Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Missouri, Patrice in Utah, Renee in Indiana, Lucy in Minneapolis, James in Indianapolis, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon jumped off a Cantor's Assembly program to be here, a very musical evening. Chaim wishing us a good Shabbos. Paula will watch later, just back from 2 funerals. Beautiful husband and wife, Vern and Vera. May the neshamas have a great aliyah. Baruch Dayan Emes. Ryan in Jacksonville. Janice in Dallas. Renee, woohoo, Maccabi USA. Chris with us in Seattle. Aoife in Ocala. Faith in Southern Oregon. And Lynn in North Texas over there on the YouTube side. As I mentioned in the title of today's episode, who controls the calendar controls history. There's a lot of truth to that, and we'll see some of that in today's daf. We are in Tractate Rosh Hashana. This is daf Yud Tes, page 19. We're still in chapter 1, and we're working our way through the Gemara, the commentary on Mishna number 3 here in chapter 1. We pick it up near the bottom of the B side of page 18. As we learned in the third Mishnah, let me turn that off. As we learned in the third Mishnah, there are 6 times of the year when the court, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, would send messengers out to make sure that the country and the people in the diaspora, even beyond the country, knew that the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem had declared that a new month had begun, right? So in the ancient times, when the calendar was not set in advance, was not preset, as it were, and a new month began only when the Sanhedrin heard testimony from witnesses who had seen that little sliver of the new moon to let them know that the new month had begun, and they proclaimed the new month had begun. It was Rosh Chodesh, and then they had to let the world know that the new month had begun so that they would all be celebrating the holidays or the fasts of that month on the correct day. And so that's generally what we're talking about. And yesterday we started to talk about this Megillas Ta'anis. So this was actually the first part of the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah that was set down. Normally we think of the Mishnah as the beginning of the writing down of the oral Torah, the Mishnah compiled by Rebbe or Yehuda Hanasi. But actually, even before the Mishnah was set down, a very short book called the Megillas Ta'anis was set down. Now, this Megillah is a scroll, a written scroll. Why did they write it down, and what were they writing down? It's basically a list of holidays, rabbinic holidays, right? The holidays that are written in the Torah are the Torah, that's the written law. We all know what they are. Rosh Hashana, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuos, etc. Other holidays were added later by the rabbis, including Hanukkah and Purim. Right, Purim is tied to, of course, what's already in Scripture in the book of Esther. The book of Maccabees didn't make it into the Bible, but the Hanukkah story was during the Second Temple period. There were other festive days that were declared by the sages and the leaders, the religious leaders of the Jewish community. I think in the First Temple period as well, but definitely in the Second Temple period. And then what the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Talmud, are discussing in this Gemara was that list of holidays, right? So these are holidays that were declared by the rabbis in the same way that Purim and Hanukkah were established later as festive days, and those have remained festive days. There were other festive days that were added to the calendar in recognition of miraculous salvation, or maybe not so miraculous, but some fantastic event that took place on behalf of the Jewish people. And then the rabbis said, okay, this is a special day in the calendar, and we're going to add it to this list, Megillas Ta'anis. And on those days, those festive days, which we've declared, the sages declared these are festive days, it would not be permitted to fast or eulogize. Why would somebody want to fast on one of those festive days? Well, fasting is something, there were communal fasts that were declared all the time, often because of a drought, right? So when there was a drought, and it just went on and on and on, then the community would fast to kind of, sort of humble themselves before God and say, it must be that the rain isn't coming because we as a community have misbehaved. We acknowledge our fault. We're fasting. We're afflicting ourselves to say that we're sorry for all the things that we've done wrong. Please, God, forgive us and send rain. Or, some other danger was confronting the community. However, on these festive days that the sages had declared as festive days that would remain festive days from year to year, on those days, fasting would not be permitted. And then the question was, after the Second Temple was destroyed, were these earlier festive days added to the calendar by the rabbis, by the sages, not festive days that were inscribed in the written Torah, would they remain festive days, or would they be nullified? And then if a community wanted to declare a fast, they could fast on those days. As we saw yesterday, when somebody sought in the city of Lod to declare a fast during Hanukkah, two big sages who were in that community said, no, you can't do that. And to show that they didn't agree and that you cannot fast during Hanukkah, right, which is a rabbinically declared holiday, one of them went and bathed, the other one got a haircut, which are definitely actions that you don't do on a fast day. And they were saying to the community, this fast day that was declared during Hanukkah is not a fast day. And whatever you were fasting for, you're going to have to fast again after Hanukkah ends. That's where we were yesterday. Now we pick it up. Rav Acha Bar Huna raised an objection. It is stated in Megillas Ta'anis on the 3rd of Tishrei. What's the 3rd of Tishrei? The 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashana. The 2nd of Tishrei is the 2nd day of Rosh Hashana. Rosh Hashana is a 2-day holiday even in Israel, but it wasn't always a 2-day holiday in the city of Jerusalem, where everyone would know, when the Sanhedrin knew exactly when they had declared the new month. Usually that was preset once they declared the 1st of Elul, the previous month. And as we'll be discussing, Elul always had the same number of days, so then they knew when Rosh Hashana was going to hit. But in Jerusalem, Rosh Hashana was a 1-day holiday, at least at certain times in history. So the 2nd of Tishrei, not a holiday at all. What's the 3rd of Tishrei? That actually was a fast day because of the murder of Gedaliah. And we still observe that tragedy in history, which was the murder of a Jew by another Jew at the end of the First Temple period. And that's called Som Gedaliah. Okay, so the 3rd of Tishrei is a fast day. So Rav Acha Bar Huna raised an objection. It is stated in Megillas Ta'anis, on the 3rd of Tishrei, the ordinance requiring the mention of God's name in legal documents was abolished. And on that day, fasting is forbidden. So we're learning that in Megillas Ta'anis, the 3rd of Tishrei is a special day having nothing to do with Gedaliah, the murder of Gedaliah, the fast that was instituted about the murder of Gedaliah. Rather, there was an ordinance in the Second Temple period, right, when the Greeks were in charge, and there had been a kind of heavy-handed law passed by the Greek Empire on the Jews, which was, what was it? The ordinance requiring the mention of God's name in legal documents was abolished. And on that day, fasting is forbidden. Let me just read a little more. For the kingdom of Greece had issued a decree against the Jews, forbidding them to mention the name of heaven on their lips. When the Hasmonean kingdom became strong and defeated the Greeks, that's the Hanukkah story, they instituted that people should mention the name of heaven even in their legal documents. And therefore they would write, in year such and such, of Yochanan the high priest and God the Most High. And when the sages heard about this, they said, tomorrow, this one, the borrower, will repay his debt. The lender will no longer need to save the loan document. The document will be cast on a pile of dung, and the name of heaven written there will come to disgrace. And so the sages annulled the ordinance to mention God's name in documents, and they made that day into a festival. So let's review that history, right? When the Greeks were in charge of the Holy Land, they prohibited the Jews to mention the name of Hashem, the name of the deity, our God, in legal documents, right? The Romans were, the Greeks were idolaters. They had a pantheon of gods. And so they didn't want us talking about the one and only God. And they prohibited that Jews should write the name of God in legal documents. Then there was the revolt of the Maccabees that led to the Hanukkah story and the Hasmonean kings seizing control of Israel, taking it away from those Syrian Greeks. So once the Jews were in charge of the Holy Land again, they said, well, that Greek law that we can't put the name of God in our legal documents, we're doing away with that. Out with the old administration, in with the new administration. And now we require that people making a legal document, like a loan document, for example, somebody's going to lend somebody money. This is the promissory note. And they're going to date it, right? They're going to say that this is in the year of the high priest, or in the year of the king, or in the year, since the creation of the world. And they're going to mention the name of God, God the Most High. The sages did not like that. They said that was a political action to say, hey, we're in charge again. We only bow to the one God, and we want God's name in our documents. And the intent was good, but the unintended consequences of that policy were very bad. Namely, if I lend Jack $100, right? So he's going to write a promissory note to me saying that he owes me $100. When he pays me back the $100, I am obligated to give him back his promissory note so that he can tear it up and throw it away, and so that I can't at a later date say, hey, you never paid me and here's the promissory note. Or sell the note to someone else, and they go up to Jack and say, hey, I bought this note, you owe me $100. And he says, well, I already paid Sal the $100. The guy says, well, if he did, you would have torn up the promissory note. I had the promissory note right here, pay me. Right? So the way that it works with legal documents, when a loan is paid, the note that describes that loan must be torn up or somehow invalidated, clearly invalidated. And if it's going to be torn up, and if it's going to be thrown away, even on a dung heap, are we going to do that with a document in which God's name is written? That would be a terrible offense to the Most High. So the sages said, you had a nice idea, putting God's name in the documents, but it was a terrible policy. End that. Over. No more of that. And so the sages had to influence the monarchy to repeal that law. And that was not an easy thing to do, but they finally succeeded in doing it. And when they succeeded in having the monarchy repeal that law of putting God's name in documents, they declared that that day was a day of celebration, and it would be one of the festive days noted and listed in Megillas Ta'anis. And so I'm sorry, and so they annulled the ordinance to mention God's name in documents, and they made that day into a festival, a day when fasting and eulogizing would be prohibited. And if it enters your mind to say that Megillas Ta'anis has been nullified after the Second Temple was destroyed, can you say that the first prohibitions against fasting they annulled and then later ones were added? Right? I mean, this was late in the Second Temple period. Did they, annul the previous festive days because they annulled Megillas Ta'anis, but then they added new ones? They wouldn't be adding new ones if Megillas Ta'anis had been annulled. And the Gemara answers, well, with what are we dealing here? This is referring to a time when the temple was still standing, and all the days listed in Megillas Ta'anis were still in force. From time to time, new days of commemoration were added. And when the Amoraim stated that Megillas Ta'anis was nullified, they were referring to the time after the destruction of the temple. It wasn't nullified until the Second Temple was destroyed. Now, the Gemara raises a difficulty. We're at the top of page 19a. But if this was at the time that the temple was standing, derive the prohibition against fasting on the third day of Tishrei from the fact that it is the day that Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, was killed. During the time of the temple, the biblical fast days were celebrated as days of joy, right? The days that later became, in other words, there were days that were fast days because the first temple was destroyed. But then once the second temple was rebuilt, those were no longer fast days because the temple had been restored. And so the fast days from the first temple's destruction became days of joy while the second temple was standing. Once the second temple was destroyed. So in other words, Tisha B'Av must have been actually a day of joy during the second temple period because the first temple was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. Then once the second temple was destroyed also on Tisha B'Av, that's when Tisha B'Av became such a sad day on the calendar, not just a fast, but a major fast, and has many of the same laws of afflicting oneself as are active on Yom Kippur. So with respect to the third of Tishrei, if during the temple is standing, why would we observe that fast? But if this was at the time that the temple was standing, derive the prohibition against fasting on the third of Tishrei from the fact that it is the day that Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, was killed at the end of the first temple period. During the time of the temple, the biblical fast days were celebrated as days of joy. Rav said it was only necessary to include the third of Tishrei in Megillas Ta'anis in order to prohibit fasting on the preceding day as well, because fasting was forbidden not only on the actual days, the actual festive days listed in Megillas Ta'anis, but also on the preceding and the following day, when the sages declared that something wonderful had happened on behalf of the Jewish people, and we're going to turn this into a festive day from year to year, every year in the future. Not only is fasting going to be prohibited on that festive day, but also on the preceding day and the following day. The Gemara raises another difficulty. With regard to the prohibition against fasting on the preceding day of that festive, or any festive day mentioned in Megillas Ta'anis, the second of Tishrei also derive it because it is the day after the new moon. Right, the second of Tishrei, okay, if Rosh Hashana is only a one-day holiday in Jerusalem at certain times in history, so then the second of Tishrei is not a holiday, it's not second day Rosh Hashana and celebrated as a holiday, but it is the following day after Rosh Chodesh, right? And so therefore, fasting is not going to be permitted on the second day, the day after a celebration like Rosh Chodesh. And fasting is forbidden not only on festive days, but also on the preceding day and the following day. The Gemara rejects this argument. The new moon, Rosh Chodesh, is by Torah law. That's written in the Torah. The festive days that are by Torah law do not require reinforcement. Therefore, no decree was ever enacted prohibiting fasting on the days before and after. So any holiday that is in the Torah, so that was going to Rosh Chodesh, Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashana, They are in the written Torah, so they don't require chizuk. They don't require reinforcement, strengthening. So there's no prohibition on fasting the day before or the day after. The rabbinically ordained festive days that were added to the calendars by the rabbis, they have a weaker foundation. So they add more reinforcement that you can't fast for a 3-day period, not the day before, not on the festive day that they decreed, not on the day after. It's kind of interesting when you think about it. That is group psychology right there, group think. Something that doesn't require reinforcement for the public to accept it can just sit by itself. Something that is going to be more difficult to get the public to accept it, the powers that be kind of ram it down your throat with extra additional laws. Okay. As it is taught in a Baraisa, these days that are written in Megillas Ta'anis are days on which fasting is prohibited, as are both the day before them and the day after them. With regard to Shabbos and festivals that are in the Torah, Shabbos and festivals, fasting on them is forbidden, but on the day before them and the day after them, fasting is permitted, meaning a community could declare a fast because there's a drought, and they could fast on a Friday, and they could fast on a Sunday, but they can't fast on Shabbos, they can't fast on Passover, on Shavuos, etc. What is the difference between this class of days and that class of days? Well, these days, Shabbos and festivals are by Torah law, and Torah laws don't need reinforcement, and therefore, even if a fast day were decreed on the day before or after them, the festival itself would not be nullified. Whereas those days mentioned in Megillas Ta'anis are by rabbinic law, and rabbinic laws need reinforcement so that they take root in the public, and therefore fasting is prohibited even on the day before and the day after. The Gemara raises yet another difficulty. The prohibition against fasting on the second day of Tishrei, right? Rosh Hashana is the first of Tishrei. The Tzom Gedali, the fasting of Gedali, is on the third day of Tishrei. The prohibition against fasting on the second day of Tishrei derive it from the fact that it is the day before the day that Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, was killed. And since in temple times the fast of Gedaliah was celebrated as a festive day, right? Now that the second temple is destroyed for the last 2,000 years, Tzom Gedaliah is a very sad day, right? Because one Jew murdered another Jew, and that was the last vestige of sort of Jewish sovereignty over the Holy Land in the at the end of the first temple period. Once the second temple was built, that sad day of fasting was converted into a day of joy. That's how we know that when Mashiach comes, when the Messiah comes and the third temple is built, all these fast days related to the destruction of the first and second temple, like Tisha B'Av, will become a day of celebration and festivity. So, during the second temple period, the day that Gedaliah was murdered at the end of the first temple period was celebrated as a festive day because the temple had been restored when the second temple was standing. And fasting should also be prohibited on the day before, right? So since it was a rabbinic festive day, fasting prohibited on the day before and the day after. So fasting prohibited during the second temple period on the 2nd of Tishrei, the 3rd of Tishrei, and the 4th of Tishrei. Rav Ashi said, the fast of Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, on the 3rd of Tishrei, is derived from the texts of the tradition, i.e. prophets and writings. And as the texts of the tradition are treated like Torah statements for this purpose, they do not need reinforcement. So Tzom Gedaliah might have been decreed by the sages of that late first temple period, but there actually is, proof text for that in the Bible, right? Because remember that the books of the Bible were still being written at the time that the second temple was erected, right? Ezra, Nehemiah, I think Malachi, that's all second temple, early second temple period, but there were still prophets then, and there were books of the Bible being added. certainly something that happened at the end of the first temple period. There's going to be a source for it in scripture, and therefore it's not really a rabbinically ordained day. Rav Tovi bar Matana raised an objection against the opinion that Megillas Ta'anis was nullified, based on that which is written in the book Megillas Ta'anis. According to him, it was never nullified, right? The premise that we're arguing is that Megillas Ta'anis, which with these rabbinically ordained festive days, was nullified once the second temple was destroyed. So Rav Tovi bar Matana objects to this. He says, look inside Megillas Ta'anis. It says that on the 28th of Adar, so that's the month with Purim in it, the month before Nisan, on the 28th of Adar, the good tidings came to the Jews that they should not turn away from the Torah, and on that day, fasting is forbidden. What came to the Jews? The date and nature of this decree are not clearly known, and very little is known about Rabbi Yehuda ben Shemua, who we're going to read about in a moment. From the context, it seems that this incident occurred after Hadrian's decrees, which he had instituted in response to the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, the Bar Kokhba revolt was after the second temple was destroyed. The second temple was destroyed in the year 69 or 70 of the Common Era. The Bar Kokhba revolt was about 65 years later, about the year 135 of the Common Era. That was a revolt against Rome. It was a terrible idea. The Romans came down so hard on the Jews in Israel, killed about 1 million people, salted the earth, and really ruined the fertile and beautiful Holy Land for many, many, many centuries. So from the context, it seems that this incident occurred after Hadrian's decrees, his harsh decrees, which he had instituted in response to the Bar Kokhba revolt. After those decrees were relaxed, it may have occurred in the time of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who reigned from 161 to 180 of the Common Era. And although he treated the Jews with disdain, he did not act overtly against them. And perhaps the protest of the sages served to lessen the severity of the decrees. So, at any rate, it seems that in Megillas Ta'anis, there's reference to a holiday that was instituted by the sages because something good happened to the Jewish people. But this is way after the second temple was destroyed. Right? On the 28th of Adar, the good tidings came to the Jews that they should not turn away from the Torah. And on that day, fasting is forbidden. And this is explained. For the wicked kingdom, that means Rome, issued a decree against Israel that they should not occupy themselves with Torah study and that they should not circumcise their sons and that they should desecrate Shabbos. That's what keeps us Jewish. Right? That if the Jews weren't able to study Torah, keep Shabbos, and circumcise the boys, then very quickly the Jewish people would cease to exist. And the Romans had decreed you can't do those things. But then that decree was repealed. What did Yehuda ben Shemua and his colleagues do? They went and took advice from a certain matron, whom all the prominent men of Rome would visit regularly, thinking that she would know how to get that decree annulled. And she said to them as follows, "Come and cry out, hafginu, at night in the streets and markets." So they went and cried out at night, saying, "Oh heavens, are we Jews not your brothers? Are we not children of one father? Are we not children of one mother? How are we different from every other nation and tongue that you issue such a harsh decree against us?" And indeed, the decrees were annulled. And the sages made that day a festive day. That's the incident. And if it enters your mind to say that Megillas Ta'anis was nullified when the second temple was destroyed, can you say that the first prohibitions against fasting they annulled, that they annulled all those previous festive days that had been decreed before the second temple was destroyed, and then later they added new festive days? Right? If indeed they annulled Megillas Ta'anis, then they wouldn't have added new festive days after they had annulled all the old festive days that had been decreed by the sages. So it must be that Megillas Ta'anis was never nullified, and those earlier festive days are still in force, according to this argument. And if you say that here too, this is referring to the time when the temple was standing, And that's when they annulled it and then added further new days. And so this incident happened while the second temple was still standing. Well, then there is a difficulty, as Yehuda ben Shemua was a student of Rebbe Meir. And Rebbe Meir, for sure, was teaching after the destruction of the second temple. And proof that Rabbi Yehuda ben Shemua was a student of Rebbe Meir may be brought. As we learned in a Mishna with regard to glass vessels that had holes in them, which afterward were filled with lead, the sages dispute whether the utensil is considered a whole utensil, which can become tameh, ritually impure, or whether it is considered a broken utensil, which cannot become tameh. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, Yehuda ben Shemua declares that it becomes impure in the name of his teacher, Rebbe Meir. So, if Yehuda ben Shemua was the one who decreed that this would be a festive day after the Romans repealed that awful order that stopped us from studying Torah, keeping Shabbos, and circumcising our kids, and he was a student of Rebbe Meir, then it must have happened after the second temple was destroyed. And if Megillas Ta'anis was nullified when the second temple was destroyed, what were the sages doing later on, adding new festive days to the calendar? It must be that there's something wrong here. And the Gemara answers, the question whether or not Megillas Ta'anis has been nullified is the subject of a dispute between Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah. As it is taught in a Baraisa, these days which are written in Megillas Ta'anis, both when the temple is standing and when the temple is not standing, are days on which fasting is prohibited. This is the statement of Rebbe Meir. So Rebbe Meir held that Megillas Ta'anis was never nullified, and the sages that decreed that these festive days would be days on which fasting is prohibited, and they did that while the temples were standing, and then their decrees remained in force after the temples were destroyed, according to Rebbe Meir. But Rabbi Yosei says, when the temple is standing, these days are prohibited for fasting because these days are a source of joy for Israel. But when the temple is not standing, these days are permitted for fasting because these days are a source of mourning for them. The fact that we had days of joy, which in some way might have been related to the fact that we had a temple in our midst, once the temple was destroyed, now these former days of joy are actually reminders of all that we have lost, and they become sad days, and therefore fasting is permitted on those days. And the Gemara concludes, and the halacha, the law, is that these days were nullified, and the halacha is that they were not nullified. What kind of a ruling is that? The law is that the days were nullified, and the law is that the days were not nullified. What does this mean? And the Gemara asks, this is difficult, as one halacha contradicts the other halacha. And the Gemara answers, it is not difficult, la kasha. Here it is referring to Hanukkah and Purim. These festival days, which were decreed by the rabbis, they weren't given in the Bible, they were decreed by the rabbis. Right, Purim was decreed by Mordechai and Esther, but functioning in their role as the sages of their generation. These festival days were never nullified. And Hanukkah is listed among the festivals of Megillas Ta'anis, but there the halakha is referring to the rest of the days listed in Megillas Ta'anis, all of which were nullified. So of all the holidays, all the festive days listed in Megillas Ta'anis, the only ones which remain in effect are Hanukkah and Purim. But we still have Megillas Ta'anis. We know what those days are. And so presumably when the Messiah comes, Mashiach comes, and the third temple is built, then those days will become festive days again. I am almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. The Mishnah taught, messengers go out to inform about the sanctification of the new moon in Elul, due to Rosh Hashana, and in Tishrei, due to the need to establish the correct dates on which to celebrate the festivals of Tishrei. And the Gemara asks, once the messengers have gone out in the month of Elul is the month before Tishrei, to inform the people when the new moon was declared, right? In ancient times, when the calendar depended on the testimony of witnesses before the Sanhedrin, once they declared Rosh Chodesh Elul, that Elul had begun, why would they need to send messengers in Tishrei? Why is this even a question? Because Elul is always the same length. Elul never varies. There are no extra days of Elul. So once you know what the first day of Elul is, you're going to know which is the first day of Tishrei. This is what the Gemara is asking. Once the messengers have gone out in the month of Elul to inform the people when the new moon was declared, why do they need to go out again in Tishrei? As the new moon of Tishrei always falls on the 30th day after the new moon of Elul. And if you say that messengers must go out for Tishrei as well, as perhaps the court added another day to the month of Elul so that Rosh Hashana occurs on the 31st day after the new moon of Elul, there is a difficulty. Didn't Rabbi Chinana Bar Kahana say that Rav said, from the days of Ezra and onward, we have never found. So Ezra presided over the building of the second temple. Right? So from the beginning of the second temple, and it stood for 420 years, from the days of Ezra and onward, we have never found that the month of Elul had an additional day. Consequently, it is simple to calculate the days on which the festivals of Tishrei occur, and there should be no need to send out messengers in Tishrei. And the Gemara answers, when we say we have not found that the month of Elul ever had an additional day, this does not mean that Elul can never have an additional day, but only that it never happened because it was not necessary to add a day. But if it had been necessary, they would have added an additional day. And since it is possible that the month of Elul could have had another day added, there is reason to send out messengers for the month of Tishrei so that all will know when to celebrate the festival. Just because it's never happened in the last 500 years, right? So, I mean, when the Tanaim are arguing about this, right? So that's after the second temple is destroyed up until about the year 200, right? So for 600 years, it never happened that they added a day to Elul. But just because it hadn't happened in the last 600 years doesn't mean that it will never happen. Now it will never happen because our calendar is set in advance. There is no Sanhedrin in Jerusalem taking testimony from witnesses, and the calendar is preset. And we know that Elul is always going to have 30 days, and that the first of Tishrei will come on the 30th day, not the 31st day. What was it? I just want to make sure I'm saying it right. That the new moon of Tishrei, Rosh Hashana, always falls on the 30th day after the new moon of Elul, meaning Elul is always 29 days long, and then Rosh Hashana happens on the 30th day after that new moon. And that's the way it always is as long as we're using that preset calendar. But perhaps when Mashiach comes and a third temple is built, and we start there's a Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, and they start taking testimony from witnesses, now we'll have an internet, so the messengers won't be necessary. They will easily broadcast that they have declared a new day. But perhaps it will happen that there will be a 30th day of Elul and that Rosh Hashanah will come on the 31st day. We don't know. There's no guarantee. And the Gemara asks, but if Elul does have an additional day, Rosh Hashanah will be ruined because people will celebrate it 30 days after the new moon of Elul when its real date is on the 31st day. And the Gemara answers, well, better that Rosh Hashanah be ruined and all the festivals, i.e. Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and the 8th day of assembly, not be ruined. And the language of the Mishnah is also precise as it teaches. Messengers go out in the month of Tishrei due to the need to establish the correct dates on which to celebrate the festivals of Tishrei. And the Gemara summarizes, indeed, conclude from here that this is the correct understanding. Rashi explains that this was done that Elul was always a short month. It was done to avoid having Rosh Hashanah occur on a Friday or Sunday. We never want Rosh Hashanah to happen on a Friday or Sunday, which would then cause Yom Kippur to fall either immediately before or after Shabbos. And this is part of the general principle that Rosh Hashanah can never fall on Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday, right? Because we don't want Yom Kippur to be on Friday or Sunday. That's what they're talking about. You don't want Yom Kippur adjacent to Shabbos because, you wouldn't be able to cook for Shabbos during your fasting of Yom Kippur, and you wouldn't be able to prepare eating for the fast of Yom Kippur while it's still Shabbos, because you don't want to be eating on Shabbos for something that happens after Shabbos. Okay, let's go to your questions and comments. It's fun, right? It's exciting, this stuff. Like sometimes it seems technical. We're just talking about how the calendar works and the days of the calendar, etc. But when you start to get inside of it and see what was really going on politically, religiously, historically, spiritually, so much can be learned about a people and their history from the calendar. Tom, is there any evidence from the Second Temple era that Tisha B'Av was a day of celebration? Well, we haven't read about Tisha B'Av specifically, but I think what we read just now, that these days of mourning associated with the destruction of the First Temple were celebrated as festive days during the Second Temple, like that must apply to Tisha B'Av, right? Since Tisha B'Av is specifically about the destruction of the First Temple. It must be that was a festive day during the Second Temple period. I believe that is the evidence. Sharon, what about Ta'anis Esther? Ray, when can we fast? Right, well, so now we've answered that, right? Because Ta'anis Esther is first of all, the fast of Esther is not Purim, right? The fast of Esther is a fast that Esther declared. And as we see, Purim and Hanukkah, those are days that remain in the calendar. And the fast that she decreed also remains in the calendar. Tom, we do fast on Shabbos when Yom Kippur occurs on a Saturday. Very good. Yom Kippur can land on Shabbos. It cannot land on Friday or Sunday. That's what we just learned. Yes, sometimes we fast on a Shabbos when Yom Kippur falls on Shabbos. That is a big exception to the no fasting on Shabbos rule. Why would that be permitted? I think it was mentioned in Yoma, right, in Tractate Yoma that we covered, because Yom Kippur is mentioned in the Torah as the great Shabbat, the Shabbat of Shabbats, right? And so Yom Kippur is tied to Shabbos, and so we have a scriptural source for the idea that we could fast on Shabbos for Yom Kippur. Bill, that was Marcus Aurelius in a nutshell for Christians too. He ended up with a strangely good reputation among the two communities, not because he was particularly benevolent, but because he left us both, the Jews and the early Christians, alone. You know, wouldn't it be good? How often would a government be completely successful if they would just take their hands off and let people figure it out for themselves? You know, sometimes I just feel I'm not talking about conservative, Democrat, Republican, liberal, nothing like that. I'm not talking about politics. In America, as it were. But there is a bias for passing laws among lawmakers, right? It's like they feel like they can go back to their constituents and say, hey, I did something by getting new laws passed. And that's why the U.S. Code has, it's gotten so big. There's so many laws. And you know, not everyone even knows what all the laws are because there's so many laws. And sometimes it's not a law that should be the solution to the problem. Sometimes the solution to the problem comes from the people themselves. Enough said. And Yosef, this has been interesting as a study in how the transmission of the oral tradition historically extend back prior to even the Second Temple. I'm also wondering what verses from the Torah the prophets and sages use to teach us to fast. What a good question, Yosef. We're going to get there because there's Tractate Ta'anis, right? We have a tractate in the Talmud called Ta'anis, which is going to be all about declaring fast days, and I'm sure the sages will tell us there, what is their source for declaring a fast day. Okay. That's what we've got today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. Friday schedule, noon Pacific tomorrow on Friday. Have a wonderful evening.